Alright, let's start tearing into the Conshelf XIV. Conshelfs all pretty well tear down the same. The early ones are going to have the thinner yoke with the thumb screw. Some of the yokes may attach with a nut as opposed to being threaded, but you know, overall they're going to tear down the same. There's a thing or two inside that's a little different, and I'll try and point that out as we go along. This one's right out of the box from an auction site. Crusty, but all it needs is a little TLC and it'll be good to go. I think the owner of this one must have owned a grease company, because he put most of the inventory in the threads on this yoke knob. On this particular one, it has an external retaining ring, so we're going to grab our external snap ring pliers, remove that, set it aside, and unscrew the yoke so we can get it clean. For the next part, you need one of the few specialty tools, or one that I recommend you use when you're taking your Conshelf apart, is this threaded rod, which you would use to clamp this part in the vise while you're removing the high pressure side of the regulator. Other than that, you're going to need a BFW, and I've already cracked this one loose, but normally I'd have this secured in a vise and then I would loosen this, but this one's already taken the forethought to loosen that one up a little bit. Go ahead and unscrew it. It is you know, under some spring tension, so be careful as you're taking it apart. Inside you're going to find your main spring, and you can take apart the adjustment screw now, because you'll need to do a lot of cleaning on that one, obviously from the looks there. Set that aside. On the bottom side you're going to have your spring pad, and these may differ. This one happens to be one of the heavy nylon, but most of the time they are made you know, out of metal. Then you've got your gasket. This is an original phenolic. Most of the later ones were nylon, and that's what we're going to replace that with. That's what the service kit comes with. Just have to dig most of that out there. And then you're going to want to remove the high pressure diaphragm. With this you want to use a brass pick or a nylon pick, either one, and most of these have been in there so long they're very stiff, and it's not going to be easy necessarily to get it loose. Since you're not going to reuse it, using a brass or nylon pick, you're really not going to hurt anything by poking into it and pulling it back. And you can see what the insides of this one look like. And then in your hand, turn it over and drop out your pin support in your main pin. Set it aside. Now we're going to remove the high pressure side, or I guess not necessarily, where the high pressure seat is, and it has two springs in it. So when you use your snap ring pliers to remove this, you want to hold your hand over it, because there's underspring pressure, and it's gonna, sometimes they fly apart and you're gonna lose your parts, and no sense in replacing parts that are perfectly cleanable and reusable. There we go. Have our snap ring, our filter. This one doesn't have a backup washer for some reason. One spring, our crown block, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a sec. First spring, and then the high pressure seat. Crown block is going to differ a little bit depending on the regulator. The first crown blocks only had an O-ring in them. The later ones had a backup ring here and then an O-ring on the bottom. The backup ring helped prevent extrusion, and it sealed, locked up better IP-wise using higher pressure cylinders. When you remove the O-ring and the backup washer in here, you don't want to use anything other than a brass or a nylon pick, because if you scratch the inside of the balance chamber, it won't seal correctly. But using your brass, I've got a brass pick here, I can pull out the old O-ring, and this one does have a backup washer, and we'll update it with the new style here in just when we get it cleaned up. The crown block on these is interchangeable, and I do have new crown blocks available, so if you want to go ahead and update yours to one that has the backup washer as well as the O-ring, that's certainly easy to do. They're interchangeable. When you're cleaning your regulator, an area you want to pay close attention to, let me zoom in a little on that, see if I can get a little focus area in there. You notice inside here there's a lot of corrosion. So you want to be sure you get all the corrosion out of there, but what you don't want to do is damage the volcano orifice in here, because it's not removable. So tread lightly there, but you need to get this clean along with your other parts. And once we get everything cleaned up, we'll go to assembly and setup and get our Conshelf XIV ready to go back in the water. Alright, we've got our Conshelf XIV parts cleaned up and we're ready to start putting them back together. First, let's look at the crown block, which I mentioned could be different in some models. But either way, be sure that you get the crown block very clean. In most, the backup washer will go in first. You want to use your nylon or brass tool to be sure that gets centered in there correctly. And next goes the O-ring. Use your brass or nylon tool to see that it's down around the edge, all the way around. There's a lip right under here, so you'll know. You just have to take a look at it a little closer. Then take your new high pressure seat and put a little lube around the stem. You don't have to go overboard, but put some lubricant on there. And just try it in the crown block a few times just to be sure that everything's working as it should. Any excess you get on the crown block, anything like that, you can wipe off. Alright, then you take your regulator main body, put your high pressure seat in, take your long spring, put it in, crown block, and at this point I'll stop a sec before I stack the other pieces in here to say something. When you have to compress all the two springs and the crown block against the high pressure seat and get them all back into place, and the snap ring in place, it's very difficult to do all at once unless you have the right tool for it. Now the manual will show a very specific tool which I use, but Herman makes a nice version of this tool that's very inexpensive, and you basically, it's put over the first stage like that, and then this all in one motion you compress it all at once and it locks everything into place. So on top of this you would have your spring, your filter with the rough side up, they went to using a spacer in the Conshelf later, and that's what comes in the service kit. So you want to go ahead and use your filter spacer, and it should have the sharp edge up. You see if I can get a little closer. You can see it has a round edge and a sharp edge. Sharp edge should go up, and then this fits around it. Now you see how difficult that was. I did it that way just so you could see how it should be assembled, but it's much easier to do it like this. And then your circlip split ring gets started in there. And then by using this tool, with one motion, it pushes it down and the snap ring moves into place. Now, the workbench I'm working on here is a little high up for video, so it's hard for me to get any leverage on it. So I'm going to step over to my normal workbench and put this thing together, and I'll be back in 1 sec. And there we go. You can tell I don't like to do things in multiple takes. A good idea, once you've got this in here, is to take your snap ring pliers and put them on there, and just make sure that it's held in place right. I guess I should get the external snap ring pliers. These will pry apart, and you just want to make sure that it is all the way in the groove. Let me see if the camera will focus up close enough you can see. See that your snap ring's expanded all the way into the groove. Once that's done, move on to the diaphragm side and take your pin support and your pin, push it up through the center hole, and it should move in there very smoothly. And then once you've done that, you just move it up and down with your thumb just to be sure you don't feel it binding, everything moving smoothly, everything's good there. Now what I do is I take and put just a very little bit of lube, whether it's silicone or crystal lube, on this, wipe about 90% of it off. Next you're going to put in the high pressure diaphragm. Do not put lubricant all over this diaphragm. It is not made to be lubricated. Over lubricating it, in my opinion, could let it slip out of place, just especially around the perimeter. Okay, so with that said, get your new high pressure diaphragm in there. We've gone ahead and I'm not going to put a phenolic back in there, although you could if you wanted to. This is the updated nylon gasket. That goes in there. Then before I put the spring pad in, I put just a little bit of lube on here because it helps with friction with the rotation of the spring. Just a little bit right in the center, not a whole lot, just kind of enough just to make it a little bit shiny. Now if you remember our original, the one we took out, it's pitted pretty heavy. Even after I cleaned it, it's got some pits. I don't probably would never bother anything, but this regulator is going to go to a new customer, so I want them to have the best of everything, so I went ahead and updated it with a brand new spring pad. Next, your mainspring is going to go on, and then take your cap and your IP adjustment screw and just turn it in a couple of 3 turns, because you've got a pretty good sized spring to compress when you put these two halves together. It just makes it a little easier. Go ahead and get those two started together. Now get it snugged down. Everything there is feeling good. Take your vise tool, screw it in all the way, and then take your BFW and screw this down pretty tight. Now, a wrench that fits that size opening, you should have plenty of pressure on it. Once you've got those two together, you turn this in with your palm a couple of turns. Like so. Get it about like that. Be a good way to start. Then take just a little bit of lubricant just barely any. Put it on the threads here. Get our yoke on. And you can see this yoke is made to be adjustable because of, various valves, the width of various valves that it may need to fit. So that's on there. And then take your snap ring with the sharp edge up. Some people don't put the snap ring on there because they take the yoke off when they're traveling, and that's okay as long as you remember to check it. Be sure it doesn't come loose when you're trying to dive it. Turn it out. It's locked into place. That's good. I was managed to get the threads on that. I changed the 40 weight that they were covered in. Okay. That completes the assembly of this Conshelf, and we're about ready to, I'm going to hook it up to the setup jig and we'll get the IP set on it. Okay, we're ready to get the IP set on our Conshelf 14, and probably better give a little briefing just in case you haven't watched the rest of the videos. I've got the first stage set up here on my test bench, and mine's a little different than what you'd be using. You would have a cylinder here with the valve and the first stage attached to the valve. Mine's set up with incoming air from the air bank to a regulator, which allows me to quickly adjust the supply pressure between 0 and 3,600 psi, depending on the regulator first stage or the regulator I'm working on. From there, the regulator is going out to the IP gauge. Now, the IP gauge that I have here has a purge that I can use by pushing this button. Also on the back, it has a pressure relief device. And that's what I want to be 100% clear on. Don't hook up a first stage to air and turn the air on without some sort of pressure relief device in the loop. Now, that could be your second stage, which you already have hooked up because you're using it to purge and to test, workability of. Great. Your IP gauge may have a pressure relief device in it, like this one, or like my test unit has a built-in pressure relief device in it, and or these are about $6 in the store. You can get them. Screws right into any 3/8 low pressure port, and it's a pressure relief device as well. Those small pressure relief devices, if the air pressure gets, the intermediate pressure gets over 170 psi, they open up, bleed air. That keeps you from bursting hoses, bursting gauges, and possibly causing harm to yourself. So with that said, let's move along and get our IP set. IP on a Conshelf, the manuals vary through the years. You see everything that says the IP pressure should be between 120 and 160. So you kind of 6 to 1/2 dozen of the other. 135 is where I normally set a Conshelf, which I also refer to as the single hose Royal Aquamaster, but beside the point. And I check it both at 500 and at 3,000 psi. So without further ado, let's get started. You can go ahead and turn on some branch line air and adjust it to about 500 psi. And if we look at our IP gauge right now, we can see, and I'm sorry I can't focus in a whole lot closer and be able to still see everything. We're at about 110 psi. Now, if you watch the videos with the piston regulators, as I went clockwise, I decreased the pressure. But with a balanced diaphragm regulator, as you go clockwise on the IP adjustment screw, you're going to increase the IP. So when you're doing this, there's no need to make drastic movements, because you'll see that if you see the gauge, you watch the gauge in the background, you can see it move pretty quickly. Make small changes, and then a few purges. When I'm purging, I try to keep the purge more like you're taking a breath. So tap dancing on it, it's annoying and really doesn't accomplish much. And we are right at about 130 right now. I'm going to go ahead and bring it on up a little bit more. All right, we're at about 135 at 500 psi on the branch line. So I'm going to go ahead and turn the supply air up to 3,000. And I'm going to purge this a couple of times. It's between 135 and 140. Ideally, you don't need to mess with it. It's fine. It's well within range. Conshelf instructions say unless it goes over 160, you have a problem. But the final lockup should not creep plus or minus 5 psi. So at this point, I would shut the air off, and I'd let it set a good 10-15 minutes and see IP's locked up, everything's good. Then what you want, a couple of things in here. You notice that the big diaphragm that we put in there, it has some flexibility to it and will have some memory for after you've been using it for a while until it really gets stretched in. Same way with the high pressure seat. You may need to cycle this words. According to Pete Wolfinger, the author of Regulator Savvy, says he does not believe a seat is really developed its groove or its full seating capacity until it's been cycled 200 to 300 times. On a conshelf like this, I shut the air off, and once I realize it's not creeping, it's not going to move, I might leave it overnight. But either way, I'm going to cycle this thing 15, 20 times, bleed the air off of it, just like I've got the air shut off now. I'm going to bleed the air off of it, walk away, come back a little while later, turn the air back on, cycle it again 15 or 20 times until I get to that point to where nothing changes, everything's solid, locks up every time, no creep, and then after that I just I shut it off for a while and check to see if there's got any leaks from any port plugs or anything like that, and other than that I call it good. And this regulator, in my opinion, is good to go back in the water. Thanks very much for watching the video. I hope you got some good information from it. Remember that parts for your Conshelf, Titan, of almost all the models there are available at Vintage Double Hose. Also in the manuals and catalog section you can find the factory manuals as well as the part schematic for the regulator you're working on, which I highly recommend you print out and have a copy for yourself. Thanks for your time.